Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. This is Biology 205 at Illinois Central College. We are studying Chapter 13 today, the spinal cord, spinal nerves, and spinal reflexes. Objectives for this unit include the following: to understand the different divisions of the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system and their function. This includes the somatic, autonomic, sympathetic, and parasympathetic nervous systems. We'll also have you understand spinal cord structure. So this includes all of these anatomic structures: white and gray matter, including the function, the anterior median fissure, the posterior median sulcus, the dorsal column, the dorsal root ganglion, ventral root, the cervical enlargement, the lumbosacral enlargement, which includes the cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacral, and coccygeal areas, the conus medullaris, the cauda equina, the filum terminale, the spinal nerves, and the central canal. We'll also have you know the structure and function of anaxonic, pseudo-unipolar, bipolar, and multipolar neurons. We covered this in the previous chapter in the previous lecture. And also to know the function and the location of the epineurium, the perineurium, fascicles, the endoneurium, neurolemma, which is also known as the sheath of Schwann, and an axon with a myelin sheath. Objectives also include to know and understand the function of monosynaptic and polysynaptic reflexes and examples of each. What is a reflex arc? Know the 7 parts of a reflex arc and be able to identify the function of the 3 different neurons in the arc. What is the difference between autonomic and somatic reflexes? Between innate and acquired reflexes? Know examples of each, the following, and whether they are monosynaptic or polysynaptic: stretch, withdrawal, crossed extensor, patellar, Achilles, gag, and pupillary. And by the way, you're going to be working with all of these different reflexes in the lab this week. Also, which type of reflex is the fastest? What is the function of a reflex? And what is the function of gray matter and of white matter? Where are they located in the peripheral nervous system and the central nervous system? Also, what are the meninges? Know their location on a diagram and know the function of each, including the spaces between. What is the function of ascending and descending tracts? Know the relationship of the ventral and dorsal roots, spinal nerve, ventral and dorsal ramus, and the rami communicantis. What is a dermatome? What is a nerve plexus? Identify the following nerves and place them into the cervical, brachial, lumbar, and sacral plexuses: the phrenic, radial, axillary, ulnar, median, sciatic, femoral, fibular, which is also known as the common peroneal, and tibial. As always, our lecture is going to follow the structure of your textbook, so that way you can follow along and press pause if you need to. So let's start off with section 13-1, anatomic organization. And as we go through this chapter, we're going to start from the most general and work to more specific functions. So we're going to look at the general anatomy first in this section, then we'll look at some gross anatomy in a little more detail in section 13-2, then we're going to move on to the function and location of gray and white matter. Then we're moving out to peripheral nerves, their structure and function. We'll then discuss interneurons, then neural reflexes, and then we're going to discuss different types of reflexes. We'll discuss monosynaptic and polysynaptic reflexes, and then finally, we're going to pull it all together with how the brain facilitates and or inhibits certain reflexes. At its most basic level, the nervous system is broken down into the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system consists of your brain and the spinal cord. And then the peripheral nervous system is everything peripheral to that. So that includes cranial nerves and spinal nerves. And so really what's happening here is that the peripheral nervous system is going to be sensing the environment and then taking that information and sending it to the central nervous system for processing. And then that processing is going to allow for motor response pathways to be sent from the central nervous system to the peripheral nervous system out to all sorts of effectors. So this can include things like our muscles, our glands, our adipose tissue. So this is the general layout. You can see in figure 13-1 in your text. It shows you there's a brain and spinal cord just hanging out all by itself. So that's the central nervous system. And then the sensory receptors from all over the body are sending their sensory input over spinal nerves down lower in the body, and then up higher in the body we'll have our cranial nerves doing the same thing. The brain and spinal cord will be able to understand this information, process it, and then send out a motor command either through the cranial nerves or down below on the right you'll see through the spinal nerves. We're all familiar with reflexes. These are responses that are quick and automatic, and they're triggered by a specific stimuli. Now, spinal reflexes are kind of amazing because the brain is not involved in any way with a spinal reflex. The spinal cord itself is the processing center. So that means that literally you will have sensation in your hand. The nerves will pass that action potential up through to your spinal cord, and the spinal cord will then send a motor command back to your hand to let go of something hot without ever going to your brain, without ever thinking about it. So we're going to talk a little bit more about spinal reflexes coming up. Let's review some general anatomy in section 13-2 in your text. The spinal cord is an incredibly important structure because it's going to be carrying sensory information from all over our body and sending that information up to the brain for processing. And then it's going to be carrying information back down from the brain towards the rest of the body. So because of that incredibly important function, it's protected in two ways. The first is we have something called the meninges, which is a soft tissue layer that wraps circumferentially around the spinal cord throughout the length of it. There are 3 layers of the meninges, and we'll talk about that coming up. There's also bony tissue, the vertebra, which are the bony components of our spine that wrap around the spinal cord as well. So the spinal cord has both soft tissue wrappings, the 3 layers of the meninges, and bone around it to keep it safe. The anatomy of the spinal cord is pretty neat. So it's about 18 inches long in most adults and about half an inch wide, and it only grows up until the age of 4, which is fascinating. After the age of 4, our vertebra are going to grow, and so will the spaces between them and the discs, for example. So that will continue to grow, but the cord in and of itself will stop lengthening at that point. When you look at the cord on the right, you'll see that it's broken up into different regions. So there are 4 different regions, and they're symmetrical bilaterally from right to left, and that's broken down into the cervical, thoracic, lumbar, and sacral regions. So in the image on the right, which is figure 13-2 in your text, you'll see up at the top in blue, there are cervical spine nerves, and you see that they're numbered 1 through 8. And then down below that, you're going to see that there are thoracic spinal nerves, and those are numbered 1 through 12. And then you'll see in green lumbar spinal nerves, and those are labeled L1 through L5. And then the sacral spinal nerves are going to be labeled S1 through S5. And there's also a coccygeal nerve way down at the bottom and the filum terminale, which we'll discuss last. But those regions, the cervical, thoracic, lumbar, and sacral, are how we are able to define what the spinal nerves are so we can number them and refer to them appropriately. So cumulatively, there are 31 segments of the spinal cord. In figure 13-2, you'll see a cross-section of a normal adult spinal cord. So let's talk about some general structures you should be familiar with up front before we go any further. So what you're going to see are 2 different colors, right? There's white and gray matter, both shown as labeled in this image. And white matter, if you remember from our previous lectures, is composed primarily of the axons of neurons, and they're usually myelinated. And then the gray matter is going to be composed of primarily the neuron cell bodies. In the very center of this, you'll see there's a central canal, and in the central canal, we'll have blood vessels run along there that provide nutrients to the spinal cord that can diffuse out to the spinal cord. So now let's look at the very top of the image. You'll see that there's a groove in the very center, and that groove is the posterior median sulcus. And then if you look at the very bottom of the picture, you can deduct, of course, that's the anterior aspect. And it's not just a groove on the anterior aspect. There's actually a fissure, which is really a tear. So you can see it almost ruptures entirely on the anterior aspect. So the anterior median fissure is considerably much more of a groove than the posterior median sulcus. The posterior median sulcus, just a groove. The anterior median fissure is more like a tear. There are a couple other structures here as well. So we have the posterior root coming off of the posterior aspect, as you'll see that labeled at the top left. And then there's a larger area in that posterior nerve root, and that is called a spinal ganglion. Now, the posterior root and the anterior roots are going to merge together on each side, and this happens at every level throughout the spinal cord, to form a single spinal nerve. But I want to go back for 1 second to discuss the central canal. The central canal is also very important because it contains cerebrospinal fluid, and that has importance clinically, as you can imagine. We'll discuss this more coming up as well. So let's look at some structures at the very bottom, at the most inferior aspect of the spinal cord. So first we have the conus medullaris, and what this is a conical, hence the word conus, area of this cord that is just below the lumbar enlargement. So you'll see in the image on the right that it's boxed in red, so you can see where the conus medullaris is. It looks like a little inverted triangle pointing down, so I hope you can see that if you look closely. Next, we need to identify the cauda equina, and remember the word caudal meaning towards the tail, and equina, like equine, horse. It means horse's tail, and that's exactly it. And the reason it looks like a horse's tail is because all the nerve roots separate from, instead of being one tight, round, smooth, homogeneous spinal cord, into many thin thread-like threads of a horse's tail. So hence the name, the cauda equina. And then finally, when we get a little bit more inferior, you're going to see labeled the filum terminale. Think of a bus terminal. It's the end of the line, right? And so what we're looking at here is a blue thin line is indicated on the image to the right. And what the filum terminale does is it provides structure on a superior to inferior basis for the spinal cord. So what it does is it attaches most inferiorly to the coccygeal ligament. So this is more or less what holds the spinal cord down. It's an anchor to the very bottom of our body, whereas the brain is more or less the superior anchor. So let's look at this image here, which is a little bit more complicated than the previous cross-sectional image of the spinal cord. So starting from the center, we have our white and gray matter of the spinal cord, and what we have coming off the sides are all of the roots that are going to form our spinal nerves. So around the spinal cord, you're going to see the black area, and this black area is going to consist of cerebrospinal fluid, which provides a buffer for the spinal cord. There's also 3 layers of meninges, the dura mater, arachnoid mater, and pia mater, and that's moving from exterior to interior, and we'll discuss this more coming up. Exterior to that is a little bit of adipose tissue that actually also helps to cushion the spinal cord and keep it nice and safe. And then most lateral or most peripheral to that are the vertebral bodies. So the vertebral body is the bony part of our spine which protects the spinal cord. So let's talk about the structures coming off of the lateral aspects of the spinal cord. So we have both anterior roots and posterior roots, right? So that's easy enough. So on both sides, it's exactly the same. The anterior root, also known as the ventral root, consists of axons of motor neurons. And the posterior root, also known as the dorsal root, is going to consist of axons of sensory neurons. So I've been trying to think of a way to explain this that would make sense, and I can't come up with a very good analogy. The very best I can come up with is some shifty business model where they bring people in through the back door who are sick, for example, and then people leave healthy, looking great on the front end of the store. So you have all the sensory information coming in the back door through the posterior root, and then all of the motor commands coming out are going to be coming out through the front door through the anterior root. I hope that helps you. So the spinal nerves are also going to divide into rootlets before they actually enter or leave the spinal cord. So there are more specific images that will show you in detail what those are coming up. Spinal ganglia are also called dorsal root ganglia, and what these are spaces where there are cell bodies of the sensory neurons that form the posterior root. And these are going to be located between the pedicles of adjacent vertebra, which is just a specific part of the vertebra. So overall, spinal nerves are going to be formed by both a posterior and an anterior root coming together, and they're paired. So there's one on each side at each vertebral level as you go down the entire spine. And each one is also going to have a white ramus communicans and a gray ramus communicans. And communicans, meaning communicate, is exactly what you think it is. It's going to be a thin thread-like communication between a couple structures. So that's going to help to innervate glands and smooth muscle. Now, the nerves we just discussed before were either sensory or motor, right? So afferent or efferent. Remember the acronym SAME, sensory, afferent, motor, efferent. So some mixed nerves are actually going to contain both. Now, when I was in grad school studying anatomy, we had to memorize every single one and which one was mixed, which one was afferent, which one was efferent, et cetera, et cetera. That's beyond the scope of this class, but it's important for you to recognize that mixed nerves will contain both afferent and efferent fibers. And each spinal nerve is going to divide into rami. So there's posterior ramus, which is the singular, and anterior ramus. So the posterior ramus is going to be supplying the skin and the muscles of the back, with nerves, and then the anterior ramus is going to be supplying most of the body wall, our skin, and our limbs. So let's discuss how the spinal cord has the spinal nerves broken down and organized. So we already talked about the regions before. So up at the top of the image on the right, you'll see in blue, that would be the cervical region. Then we have thoracic immediately inferior to that. Then the lumbar in green, and then sacral in pink, and then the coccygeal is just a little yellow area at the bottom. So we're going to break down spinal nerves per the vertebra in the area where those nerves arise from. So let's start off at the top. So C1 is going to be the first cervical nerve, and it runs right above the first cervical vertebra. So the first cervical bone, right? So then it goes C1, C2, C3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, all the way down inferiorly. And when we get to C8, it's actually running below the 7th cervical vertebra. And we keep numbering going on, but we don't have 8 cervical vertebra. We have 7 cervical vertebra. So the numbering changes at that level to accommodate for keeping all of the other vertebra named in order. So the next vertebra is going to be the thoracic first vertebra, and therefore we will have the thoracic first spinal nerve. So the first thoracic spinal nerve is actually running below the first thoracic vertebra. And for all of the others, they're going to be named for the vertebra that is above it. So for example, T1 is below the first thoracic vertebra. So it just keeps counting all the way down from there to keep things organized. The image that you see on the right is from the same textbook that we use, except from a previous edition that was published in 2014. But I really like this image because it shows you in a very simple schematic the 2 enlargements of the spinal cord. So at the most superior aspect, we have the cervical enlargement, and then more inferiorly, we have the lumbosacral enlargement. So I hope that you can identify those as they're labeled on the left side of the image. So the cervical enlargement is there because we have multiple nerves that are exiting, and they are sending nerves to the arms. The lumbosacral enlargement is going to be larger too because we have a lot of nerves exiting to the legs. So let's discuss the spinal meninges. These are the 3 membranes that circumferentially wrap around the spinal cord to keep it protected. So there are 3 specialized membranes: the dura mater, arachnoid mater, and pia mater. The dura mater is the outermost layer, and dura meaning durable. It is literally meaning tough mother. I'm not kidding. That's actually the way that you would translate that. Dura mater, it is tough material. And so we also have below that the arachnoid mater, which is the middle layer, and the pia mater is the innermost layer. So the pia mater is very, very, very fine and very thin. And then the dura mater, of course, is the most tough, with the arachnoid mater being intermediate between the 3. So it's kind of like Goldilocks and the 3 bears. We have too hard, too soft, just right. Okay? So the functions of the spinal meninges are to protect the spinal cord and to provide blood so that way nutrients and gas exchange can occur for the spinal cord and nerves. So the spinal meninges are continuous with the cranial meninges, which is that same type of material that's membranous that circumferentially surrounds the brain that holds cerebral spinal fluid. And a really interesting clinical correlation is meningitis. I'm sure many of you have been vaccinated for various types of this already, but there are different types of meningitis, right? There is viral or bacterial, and these arise here and there on college campuses because it's just easy to spread things there in general. But meningitis is literally an inflammation of the meninges, and when they become inflamed, it's typically due to an infection. So this can have terrible sequelae because anytime the spinal cord or the brain has anything compressing upon it, there will be all sorts of symptoms and potential permanent damage. So the dura mater, or tough mother, is the outermost meningeal layer, and it's tough because it's composed of dense collagen fibers. The dura mater is going to be continuous with the cranial dura mater, and it fuses with periosteum of occipital bone. So the periosteum is the surrounding part of bone at the most superficial aspect of it. So it basically merges with the bone in the way that a ligament would. The distal end of this is going to taper down, and that dense cord of collagen fibers is going to join the filum terminale, which, as you remember from before, is at the most caudal end of the spinal cord, and it becomes the coccygeal ligament, so that way it anchors the most caudal aspect of our spinal cord down. The epidural space, which has clinical significance for giving women in child delivery an epidural, which is an anesthetic that will help to calm everything down and effectively numb them from the waist down. So the epidural space is going to be the space that is in between the vertebra and the dura mater, and this is going to be superficial to the dura mater, right? So you have to get in through the tough mother dura mater in order to inject the anesthetizing agent. And so that epidural space isn't just a space that's vacuous with nothing in it. It contains loose connective tissue and also a little bit of adipose tissue as well. So the subdural space is going to be the potential space that is deep to the dura mater. But when I say potential space, that's because it doesn't exist in living people. The dura and the arachnoid mater, which is right adjacent to it, is actually pretty much fused in healthy humans. But anytime you're going to look at any type of specimen or image of a cadaver, there's going to be a space there. So just keep in mind, in normal, alive, healthy people, you're going to have the dura mater completely attached to the arachnoid. So on the superficial aspect, it's going to be the dura mater, and on the deep aspect, or the more interior aspect, you're going to have the arachnoid mater. The arachnoid mater is going to be our middle meningeal layer. So like I discussed before about Goldilocks and the three bears, the too hot, too cold, and just right, the arachnoid mater is softer and thinner than the dura, but still tougher and more durable than the pia mater. So it's right in the middle of the three. The arachnoid mater is consisting of two main components. There's the arachnoid membrane, and if you remember the movie from the early 90s, Arachnophobia, which is fear of spiders, that will help you to remember the arachnoid mater is a web-like layer of simple squamous epithelia. Interesting, right? Because remember, simple squamous epithelia is important for diffusion. And it's also composed of arachnoid trabeculae, which is a network of collagen and elastic fibers in between the arachnoid membrane. So effectively, the arachnoid membrane is there to allow for diffusion, whereas the trabeculae are the structural supports or the scaffold that hold the arachnoid membrane together. So subjacent to the arachnoid mater is the subarachnoid space, right? The under the arachnoid space. And this has the arachnoid trabeculae, and it's in between the mater and the pia mater. It's going to be filled with cerebral spinal fluid, which of course carries dissolved gases, nutrients, and waste. And the subarachnoid space has clinical correlation in that this is the site where a spinal tap or a lumbar puncture would be performed. So this is where the needle will go into to withdraw cerebrospinal fluid so it can be tested for things like meningitis. The pia mater is the innermost meningeal layer, so it is very thin and very fine and right near the spinal cord itself. So the pia mater is composed of a mesh of both collagen and elastic fibers, and it is there to attach the underlying neural structures that surround it. There are blood vessels for the spinal cord that are going to be on the surface of the pia mater, so you'll see this if you're ever looking at any great images of anatomy specimens. And this is within the subarachnoid space, meaning it's underneath the dura and underneath the arachnoid mater. There are paired denticulate ligaments, and what these do is anchor the pia mater to the dura mater. And this prevents any lateral movement of the spinal cord. So basically that means that your spinal cord isn't moving left to right. It's going to hold it in place, anchored left to right. So denticulate ligaments anchor laterally. And then we have at the most inferior aspect our filum terminale extending down to the coccygeal ligament to anchor our spinal cord inferiorly. And then of course, superiorly, we have the brain. Figure 13-4 in your text is fascinating because it shows you the real-life anatomy of the spinal cord and not just some caricature type schematic to help you learn the general parts. So first off, let's look at this. At the most superior part of this image, you can see that the anterior median fissure is labeled, and it really doesn't look like much. It's not nearly as marked as it is in the schematics that we looked at previously. So there's the anterior median fissure there to help orient us. And then you'll see some pia mater, the thin, fine material that's being peeled away from the spinal cord itself. And then if you look laterally, you'll see that pia mater is continuous with the denticulate ligaments that are anchoring our spinal cord laterally. Beneath that, you will see the posterior root of the spinal cord coming off there and the anterior root, and they will merge. They're both formed by rootlets, but when the anterior and posterior root merge, you will then have a spinal nerve. You'll also see a little bit more inferiorly. The arachnoid mater has already been reflected, and it's slightly more dense. And the dura mater is what you see at the most lateral aspects of both sides of the image. The pink, homogeneous, shiny stuff, that is the dura mater. It is very tough and very rigid, and it looks almost like a giant blood vessel that's just been peeled back. So then at the most inferior aspect of the image, you'll see a spinal blood vessel that's running along the pia mater, and you can see the brownish purple shade showing you how it runs longitudinally. All right, pop quiz time. Name the area of the spinal cord where nerves for the arms exit. Is it A, the cauda equina, B, cervical enlargement, C, conus medullaris, D, filum terminale, or E, lumbar enlargement? Well, we know that it has to be an enlargement, right? Because if there's going to be a lot of nerves leaving towards the arms, it's going to have to be a thicker part of the spinal cord. So that will rule us out of options A, C, and D, because none of those are enlargements. The cauda equina, conus medullaris, and filum terminale are all way down at the most inferior aspect of the spinal cord, so that's nowhere near where the arms would exit, right? So then we have to think, is it the cervical enlargement or the lumbar enlargement? Well, the lumbar enlargement is exactly where you think it is, by our lumbar spine, so that's down in our lower back. The cervical enlargement is much more superior, and that is in fact the correct answer. That's where the nerves for the arms exit. Name the tough outer connective tissue covering of the spinal cord and brain. Is it A, arachnoid mater, B, arachnoid space, C, dura mater, D, epidural space, or E, pia mater? Well, we know it's one of the maters, right? Because we know we have 3 layers of coverings around the brain and the spinal cord. We have the pia mater, arachnoid mater, and dura mater. The dura mater is the most durable, hence the most tough. Again, it's a tough mother. So the answer here is C, dura mater. Let's move into section 13-3 and discuss gray and white matter. Just a quick reminder on the difference between gray matter and white matter before we go any further. Gray matter is composed primarily of cell bodies of neurons, neuroglia, and unmyelinated axons, whereas white matter is going to be composed primarily of myelinated and unmyelinated axons. Gray matter is organized into nuclei and horns, and when you hear the word nuclei, you're going to be thinking of course, a nucleus from a cell. And it's kind of like that because remember, gray matter does have most of the cell body, which would house the nuclei as well, right? So the CNS will have these nuclei, and the nuclei are going to be organized into different areas, and those areas are called horns. So there are posterior horns, anterior horns, and lateral horns. Makes sense. The posterior horns are going to be somatic and visceral sensory nuclei, which has information coming in from the receptors, right? So remember, posterior, I use the acronym MAPS. So motor, anterior, posterior, sensory. Okay, and we also know that sensory is afferent and motor is efferent if we use my same acronym. So the posterior horns are receiving all the sensory information with sensory nuclei. The anterior horns are sending out motor signals. So we have somatic motor nuclei going out towards our muscles and other effectors. And then we have lateral horns as well. And those can be broken down into thoracic and lumbar segments and visceral motor nuclei. So another way that we break down gray matter is we have gray commissures. And gray commissures are just bands of gray matter that are around the central canal of the spinal cord. And this is the site where axons will cross to communicate with the other side of the spinal cord. So it is the sensory or motor nucleus location within the gray matter that's going to determine what part of the body it's going to control. Figure 13.5 from your text is a micrograph, or this is an image microscopically of a cross-section, specifically a transverse section through the spinal cord on something that's called a whole mount, meaning that it's a really big slide that can hold the whole entire cross-section of the spinal cord. So this whole mount here is going to show us microscopically what an H&E stain looks like, which is hematoxylin and eosin, which is our standard stain in the lab, what it looks like. So at the superior aspect of the picture, we are looking at the posterior aspect of the spinal cord, and then the anterior is inferior on the image. So we have the anterior median fissure. You can see it's a little more pronounced here than it was in the gross image. And then at the posterior aspect, we have the posterior median sulcus, which is very subtle and very easy to miss if you weren't looking for it specifically, because it's just a slight groove. You can see very clearly the central canal in the center, right? You can see your gray matter, you can see your white matter, and you can also see the dura mater at the perimeter that's peeled away a little bit from the outer surface of the spinal cord itself. There are other structures here, like you can see the posterior root and the spinal ganglion and anterior root, but it's a little bit messy, and this is the sort of thing that pathologists are trained to be able to look at microscopically. But for you, you just need to look at the parts here of the gray matter in the spinal cord, and you'll see them labeled as the posterior horn, lateral horn, and anterior horn. And it's just the areas in general of the gray matter in the spinal cord. So it's the general region is posterior, for example, and the general region of the anterior is the anterior horn. The white matter of the spinal cord is going to be broken up into 3 columns, and the columns are going to run superior to inferior as per anatomic position, right? So the columns are really just regions of the white matter that is in the more superficial area of the spinal cord itself. So there is the posterior white columns, the anterior white columns, and then the lateral white columns, right? And so I'm saying columns plural because it's bilateral. There's one on the right, one on the left, right? So the posterior white columns are going to run between the posterior horns and the posterior median sulcus, right? Remember that posterior groove. The anterior white columns are going to run between the anterior horns and the anterior median fissure, which was that big tear sort of spot. And then at this point, we have an anterior white commissure. And this is where the axons are going to gain access to the other side of the spinal cord. So the axons can stretch out and communicate with the other side of the spinal cord. And then lastly, we have the lateral white columns. So these are on each side of the spinal cord between the anterior and the posterior. So just think anterior, posterior, and stick the lateral in between them. Figure 13-5 in your text shows you both the gray matter and the white matter and how that is subdivided. So first off, let's orient ourselves to the image. So at the very top of the image, we have the posterior median sulcus, which is just that little groove, but then we have the big anterior median fissure, the big tear on the inferior aspect of the image. So then we have, of course, our posterior root and anterior root coming off of both sides of the spinal cord. But then when we talk about what's actually inside the spinal cord, the gray matter in the most central or deep aspect has the posterior horn, then the lateral horn in between the posterior, and finally the anterior horn. And then when we look at the white matter, remember we break it down into columns, and I think about those ancient Grecian structures that are just stunningly beautiful with the big, tall, white Doric columns. So the white columns are at the perimeter, right? So we have the posterior white columns on both the right and the left side. We have the lateral white columns, again, on the left and the right, and the anterior white columns, again, on the left and on the right. Within the white matter, we have something called a tract, and a tract is a bundle of axons in the central nervous system. And what they're doing is relaying information in one direction. So we have either ascending or descending tracts. So ascending, of course, are taking sensory information from our body up to the brain. And the descending tracts are taking motor information from the brain down the spinal cord out to the different effectors. Another quick pop quiz. Sensory neurons entering the spinal cord are known as A, afferent neurons, B, efferent neurons, C, interneurons, or D, ganglia. Okay, so I think we're going to rule out C and D right away. Those were kind of gimmies, right? So now we're stuck with afferent or efferent neurons. So we know that they're sensory, remember that acronym, same, sensory afferent, motor efferent. So the answer is A, afferent neurons are sensory neurons that enter the spinal cord. Motor neurons exit the cord through the A, dorsal root, B, ventral root, or C, dorsal root ganglion. I think you can probably all rule out the dorsal root ganglion because if you remember from the images that we looked at before, the dorsal root ganglion is an enlargement of the root that's after it's already left the spinal cord. So if we're talking about what actually exits the cord, it has to be either the dorsal or ventral roots. So remember, the dorsal root and ventral root have other names, right? They're both anterior or posterior. So this is where I use my MAPS acronym. Motor, anterior, and then posterior is sensory, right? So motor is anterior, so therefore motor neurons are ventral because ventral is anterior. So the answer is B, the ventral root. All right, let's look at section 13-4, peripheral nerves. So surrounding our spinal nerves, we have three connective tissue layers to protect them: the epineurium, perineurium, and endoneurium. So you can always think of this as anything endo is always within. It's the most innermost. Think of endoscopy when we stick a tube down someone's throat to look at their gastroesophageal junction or other stomach structures, for example. So endo is innermost. Peri meaning around, and epi is more of a grand outermost term. So epineurium is the most outer aspect of this connective tissue layer, and it is composed of a network of collagen fibers. The perineurium in the middle is still around, and it's going to separate the nerve into fascicles, which are bundles of axons. And the endoneurium is the innermost, and so the endoneurium is going to surround each individual axon. Figure 13-6 in your text shows you a scanning electron micrograph of peripheral nerve fibers, and it also shows you a schematic on the left of what a typical peripheral nerve looks like with all of the different types of connective tissue wrapping it together, holding it tight. So at the most outer aspect, of course, we're going to have our epineurium, right? It's the grandest, most large outer covering. So it's covering the whole entire peripheral nerve. And then you're going to see there's little bundles inside of nerves that have that pink circle around them, and that is perineurium. So they're around fascicles, which are bundles of axons. And then below that, when you get down at a smaller level, you can look at the single myelinated axon at the very, very, very bottom. And the endoneurium is going to be surrounding that. And you can even see Schwann cells wrapping around, myelinating the axon to insulate it. So spinal nerves are paired spinal nerves because they have one on each side. So they're emerging laterally from each spinal cord segment, and they're formed by the junction of both an anterior and a posterior root that we looked at in the previous images. And it's worth noting that our spinal nerves are all mixed nerves, meaning they both have sensory and motor components to them. Now, peripheral nerves are different than spinal nerves because these form from branching and resorting of spinal nerves. So we will have mixed nerves that are sensory and motor. And then there are some connective tissue layers that have spinal nerves that are continuous with them as well. So we talked before about how spinal nerves are mixed. They're both sensory and motor. But in addition to motor impulses, the posterior, anterior, and white rami will also be able to carry sensory information. The image that you see on the right is figure 13-7 from your text, and it's showing you a map called a dermatome map, and it is showing all these different areas on our body that are innervated by a single pair of spinal nerves. And we say pair because it's bilateral, one on each side of our body, right? So if you look at the hand, you're going to see on the third and fourth digit that it's labeled C8, right? So that is saying that is spinal nerve, cervical nerve 8 that would innervate that area. And I point this out to you specifically because I have a clinical story for you. Back in 2013, just before I married my husband, I was running on a treadmill trying to lose weight, and I turned over and looked at him while he was on the elliptical next to me. And at that exact moment, bing, I herniated a disc in my neck. So what that means is part of the disc material pressed out of its space into adjacent structures, specifically onto the nerve that was responsible for innervating my hand. So I had tremendous arm pain, and in fact, my third and fourth digits were numb, and I couldn't contract my hand because I literally didn't have any strength to do it, which means that it's a medical emergency because that nerve is being impinged so dramatically that that could cause permanent damage. So we're able to tell what part of a spinal nerve might be impacted or impaired by an injury by testing out these different dermatomes. So this is part of a neurological workup that you'll see when you do your clinical rotations. But also this is helpful for determining peripheral neuropathies. So anytime you have a regional loss of neural function that affects a dermatome, we can go back and figure out which nerve has been either traumatized or compressed, or if there was an illness that affected it as well. The clinical note in your text discusses shingles, which is a terribly painful disease that arises from the same virus that causes chickenpox, which is the varicella zoster virus. But so what you can see here in this image is the classic abdominal rash that shows up in patients as one of the very first signs of shingles. So just by the way, if you ever know anybody who has this, your best indication to them is to send them to the emergency room immediately because they can take medication if it's caught early enough that will limit the length and severity of the illness. But you'll notice that this is kind of in a weird pattern, right? It's not like right around the umbilicus. This is wrapping around in a curving sort of pattern. So go back to look at the dermatome map on the left, and you'll see that the way that the skin is kind of innervated, it is a little bit twisty. It's not just totally lateral. So what's happening here is that the rash is following the pattern of the dermatome based upon which nerve is affected. So take a moment to review figure 13-8 in your text, which is a 2-page spread that shows you the gestalt of how sensory information comes in through a number of different sources, both from interoceptors and exteroceptors throughout our body, and they come in via the posterior root. And remember, posterior is bringing in sensory information. And so it comes in to the somatic sensory nuclei in the gray matter of the spinal cord. Now, once that information is there, it can ascend up to the brain for processing and then descend back down. And then let's flip over to the right side of the page where we have motor commands. So you see here that the motor commands are going to originate in the spinal cord from either the visceral motor nuclei or the somatic motor nuclei. And that will send information out through the anterior root. And then it will divide to a number of different places. It can either go to the skeletal muscles of the back or of the body wall and limbs, or it could be going out to the abdominal pelvic viscera. But either way, it's going to divide in one of those 3 different directions, contingent upon what the motor command actually is. Nerve plexuses used to be the bane of my existence when I was studying anatomy in grad school. Fortunately, you guys will not have to go into this nearly as in depth as I had to, so consider yourselves lucky. But a nerve plexus is a complex, no joke complex, interwoven network of nerve fibers, and it's formed by all these different fibers of the anterior rami and adjacent spinal nerves. So this allows multiple spinal nerves to supply the same structures. So it's basically like branches of a tree, if you want to think of it that way. So there are 4 major nerve plexuses: the cervical plexus, which is the neck, brachial plexus for the arms, the lumbar plexus in our lower back, and the sacral plexus just inferior to that. Figure 13-9 in your text shows you 3 of these different plexuses and what they innervate. So starting off on the left, you'll see that the cervical plexus is going to be arising from C1 through C5, and it's going to innervate the muscles of the neck and diaphragm. So major nerves of the cervical plexus will include the lesser occipital nerve, the great auricular nerve, the transverse cervical nerve, supraclavicular nerve, and phrenic nerve. Phrenic nerve is a very interesting one, by the way, because that goes down to the diaphragm. The brachial plexus is C5 through T1, and that's going to innervate the pectoral girdles and the upper limbs. So over on the right, you can see listed some major nerves of the brachial plexus include the axillary nerve, which goes to our axilla, obviously, the musculocutaneous nerve, that makes sense, goes to muscles and skin, the radial nerve, the ulnar nerve, and the median nerve, and those are all the 3 major nerves of the arm. We also have the lumbosacral plexus identified here. And that's broken down to 2 different separate plexi. There's the lumbar plexus and the sacral plexus. And these will take a whole lot of different areas, including the pelvic girdle and the lower limbs. So some of the major nerves of the lumbar plexus are the iliohypogastric nerve, the genitofemoral nerve, the femoral nerve, the obturator nerve, and the femoral nerve will have a lot of clinical significance for you coming up, by the way. And then the sacral plexus is going to have superior and inferior gluteal nerves, the pudendal nerve, and the sciatic nerve. And I'm sure you've all probably heard of sciatica, which is a major source of pain in which pain originates in the back and shoots down the leg. That is a classic presentation of sciatica. Just for your notes, here this is in written form. So the cervical plexus is going to include the anterior rami of spinal nerves, C1 through C5, and it's going to innervate the scalp up behind the ear, the neck, and the diaphragm. And some of the major cervical plexus nerves, again, are the phrenic nerve, which is important for you to know, and that's from C3 to C5, which controls the diaphragm. So that is what is irritated when you get the hiccups, by the way. The lesser occipital nerve, the great auricular nerve that goes to the ear, the transverse cervical nerve, and the supraclavicular nerves. Figure 13-10 from your text shows you some cranial nerves. So there's the accessory nerve, the hypoglossal nerve, and then we have nerve roots of the cervical plexus. So you can see that that's C1 through C5, they're on the left. And then on the right, we have a list of the nerves of the cervical plexus, and look how many there are. There's the great auricular nerve, the lesser occipital, the transverse cervical, the ansa cervicalis, the phrenic, and the supraclaviculars. Figure 1311 in your text is going to show you the nerves of the brachial plexus, and you can see how that all breaks down. The short of it is you're going to need to understand that there are several major nerves, such as the musculocutaneous, the radial, the median, and the ulnar, which are over on the left side of the page that you definitely will need to know the difference between. So the brachial plexus is there to innervate our arms, but it also innervates the pectoral girdle and our upper back. So it arises from the anterior rami of C5 through T1. And these rami are first going to form three large trunks, which have the superior, middle, and inferior trunks. The trunks are going to resort their axons in order to form three cords, which are subdivisions of the trunks. So we'll have lateral, posterior, and medial cords. And the cords are each named by their position relative to the axillary artery in anatomic position. Most of these nerves from the brachial plexus are all going to come off the cords, but a few of them come off the trunks. But this is that super complicated image that I was showing you earlier with all the different branching, like the branching of a tree. So some of the most major brachial plexus nerves are the musculocutaneous, like we talked about before, doing the muscles and the skin. That comes off of the lateral cord. The median nerve, which is off the lateral and medial cords both. The ulnar nerve, which is strictly off of the medial cord. The axillary nerve, which comes off of the posterior cord, and the radial nerve, which also comes off of the posterior cord. If you recall from a little earlier on in the lecture when I told you about how I had herniated a disc in my neck back in 2013 and had pain down my arm and how some of my fingers became useless and I couldn't have any strength to clasp or grasp anything, this part here will help you make a little more sense of why that would happen. So the nerve is innervated by three separate nerves, the ulnar, median, and radial nerves, and they all pass through different locations. So the median nerve is going to pass through the small carpal tunnel on the anterior of the wrist. And remember, anterior of the wrist meaning in anatomic position, our palms face forward, right? And so it passes along there along with several muscle tendons. And I'm sure you've heard about carpal tunnel syndrome before when you have compression of the median nerve specifically. So if you look at the image on the right, you will see that the median nerve is responsible for innervating the most lateral aspect of our hand on the anterior surface, and then the distal parts of digits 1, 2, 3, and part of 4. So when carpal tunnel syndrome occurs, it's compression of that median nerve, which will affect those specific areas in the hand. So if somebody has a pinky problem, that's not carpal tunnel syndrome. That's some other compression potentially, but it's not diagnostically carpal tunnel syndrome. So what you can expect to see in carpal tunnel syndrome is a loss of sensation. Usually it can be tingly sometimes too, in the area that's supplied by the median nerve. As you can see in figure 1312, the lumbar plexus that arises off of the lumbar aspect of the spine arises from T12 to L4. And so some major nerves to know include the iliohypogastric, which is going to innervate the internal oblique and the transverse abdominis. So those are more external abdominal muscles, and the skin over the inferior abdomen and buttocks. The ilioinguinal nerve is going to supply the abdominal muscles and the skin over the superior medial thigh and portions of also the external genitalia. The genitofemoral is more of what you would think when you think of genitofemoral. It is going to innervate skin over the anteromedial thigh and also portions of our external genitalia. The lateral femoral cutaneous is going to do skin, because it's cutaneous, over the anterior, lateral, and posterior thigh. And then the femoral will do the quadriceps femoris, sartorius, which is the longest muscle in our leg, the pectineus and iliopsoas, the skin of our anteromedial thigh, and also the medial surface of the leg and foot. So the femoral does an awful lot of our leg. And the obturator is deeper. It does the gracilis and adductor magnus, brevis, and longus, which we'll study all that in the muscular system in 206. And it also innervates skin from the medial surface of the thigh. The sacral plexus arises off of spinal nerves L4 through S4, so lumbar 4 through sacral 4. And some of the major nerves that arise off of that include the sciatic nerve, which of course has a major clinical application in terms of sciatica. And this will innervate the superior and inferior gluteal nerves. Another nerve is the pudendal nerve that arises off of the sacral plexus. And then there are two branches of the sciatic nerve that are worth discussing, the fibular nerve and the tibial nerve. So when you study bones in 206, you're going to learn that in the lower leg there are two bones, the tibia and the fibula. The tibia is the one that is more medial and weight-bearing, And that's the one that creates that anterior prominence. If you look at your lower leg and feel what bone is sticking out, that's your tibia. And then the fibula is lateral, and it allows for more movement and twisting. So the fibular nerve is going to be a little bit more lateral, and the tibial nerve is a little bit more medial. As you can see in clinical note 13-3, there are 4 major nerves that innervate your foot: the saphenous nerve, the sural nerve, the fibular nerve, and the tibial nerve. And so as you see on the right, the yellow is the fibular nerve, and it's responsible for innervating the vast majority of the dorsal surface of your foot. Whereas if you look at the middle image showing you the plantar aspect of the foot, you'll see that it's the tibial nerve that's responsible for innervating the vast majority of the foot. So we can actually test out to see which nerves are potentially damaged by poking with a sharp object. I'm not kidding you, that's actually what's done. It's a specific sharp object nonetheless. But we can poke at these different areas to determine if somebody has sensation or if those areas have nerve damage. Let's discuss interneurons, which is section 13-5 in your text. So far in this course, we've discussed sensory neurons, motor neurons, and interneurons, but only briefly. So sensory neurons are our afferent neurons. So they are bringing sensory information from our body to the central nervous system. So those are incoming messages. We have about 10 million sensory neurons, so that way we can sense a lot of different things about our environment, ranging from pain to temperature to pressure. Now, motor neurons are considerably fewer. There's only about 500,000 of those, and they're going to be sending the commands from our central nervous system, which is our brain and spinal cord, out to the peripheral effectors, and the effectors could be anything. This could be our muscles, it could be our glands. It's just basically sending a signal out for something to happen. So don't make the mistake on an exam of thinking that motor only means the skeletal system and moving your skeletal muscle. This also includes your visceral organs as well. So the motor neurons have the outgoing messages, whereas the sensory neurons have the incoming message to the CNS. Now, interneurons are, as you would probably think, in between the sensory and motor neurons. We have about 20 billion of them, so they outnumber our sensory and motor neurons together, and they're located within the central nervous system. The interneurons are such an important part because they interpret, plan, and coordinate the signals that are coming and going. So we're going to talk more about interneurons in this section. Neuronal pools are really just a whole bunch of interneurons working together as a functional unit. So it's a group working together as a team, basically. So interneurons are going to be broken down into this group of neuronal pools, and we're going to discuss each of the 5 different patterns of neural circuits coming up. And this just means the patterns by which these interneurons connect and respond and interact with one another. So each of these interneurons is going to have a limited source of input, and the same thing goes for its output. It's only going to receive so much information, it's only going to send out so much information, and it can't connect with something that's not connected to it. So it has to have a certain linear relationship. And each of these interneurons can actually have an excitatory or inhibitory response on parts of the brain or spinal cord. So let's look at each of these 5 patterns in the next couple slides. You can think of divergence and convergence as almost opposites when thinking about how it's spreading information in the central nervous system. So divergence is more or less like a telephone tree. So if you call 2 people, and each of those 2 people call 2 people, and each of those 2 people call 2 people, you obviously have this growth that's rapid and exponential. And this is also, by the way, what a pyramid scheme does too, by the way. But anyway, so divergence is a way to spread information to multiple different places simultaneously. So one example that's given in your book is that you receive both information from your eyes, and you also receive that same information at other parts of your brain for processing simultaneously. So that's a perfect example of divergence. Now, convergence is kind of going in the opposite direction. In this case, we have multiple inputs all coming into a single place. So this is a little bit different than divergence. So the example that your book gives is if you have a whole bunch of information coming in to your diaphragm and ribs, they'll be controlled by your brain at the subconscious level, but you can also control that same motor neuron by your own choice. So if you choose to take a big deep breath, you're able to actually control the same thing that your body is controlling automatically. So there are 2 different input points here. One is conscious and one is unconscious, and they both control the same thing. So that's how divergence and convergence differ from one another. Serial processing is probably the most straightforward of the neural circuits because it is just absolutely a linear relationship, like somebody playing telephone. You say something like, I like pizza, pass it on, right? And then that message gets passed over and over and over to a whole bunch of different people. And at the end of the line, hopefully they still say, I like pizza, right? This is the idea of serial processing. So pain will pass that signal sequentially through 2 different neuronal pools until it reaches our conscious brain for processing. Parallel processing is a more complicated response because it allows us to do multiple things simultaneously in response to the same stimulus. So the example here is stepping on a bee. So if you step on a bee, you're going to have several things that you need to do immediately. So one, it's going to really hurt, right? So you're going to want to get your foot off of that bee immediately, but you can't just lift your foot, because if you were to do that, you might fall over. So you have to be able to do multiple things simultaneously, such as lifting your foot and shifting your weight to the opposite foot so you don't fall over. Further, you may even actually yell or cry at about the same time when this happens. So this is a response to parallel processing, which allows us to do multiple things all at the same time in response to the same stimulus. The last neural circuit pattern that we're going to discuss in neuronal pools is called reverberation, and something that reverberates bounces back upon itself over and over again. Like, for example, if you're standing in a concert hall and you hear the sounds bounce off the walls with the acoustics. So reverberation is basically something happening over and over and over again in a circle. For example, if you beat yourself up about something, you just keep dwelling on it over and over and over. Once you get into that downward spiral, you can kind of keep going around in a circle. So we actually call this a positive feedback circuit. So what's happening here is we have collateral branches of neurons that are extending back, and they're continuing to stimulate the presynaptic neurons. So this forms a positive feedback loop, and it just keeps continuing until we either have synaptic fatigue or until some inhibition occurs to stop this cycle. Now, this sounds like a pretty crazy cycle. If something's going over and over and over again, you think, well, why would we need that? Well, it's really important in things that keep us awake, so we don't just fall asleep randomly, so we continue to breathe and don't forget to, and it also helps us to coordinate our muscles. So reverberation is actually a really important part of our maintaining normal functions and not just becoming fatigued and giving up on breathing, for example. All right, let's move into section 13-6 and discuss neural reflexes. Neural reflexes allow us to respond very quickly to something that could be injurious to us. So they are rapid and automatic responses that are also repeatable. They really don't change from time to time, so they show little variability. So we respond to a certain stimulus like pain, for example, or heat, or something that could really be injurious, like I said. So neural reflexes are the basic building blocks of all neural functions. So we're going to discuss a few different reflexes and how the reflex arc works. So what's going to happen here is first we have to sense something, right? So for example, we sense pain. So the receptor senses it, sends that information along through a sensory neuron, which is an afferent neuron. It gets processed in the central nervous system, and then that same information has to be transmitted in terms of some sort of response. How will you actually do something to accommodate the fact that you just felt pain? Well, that information comes from the central nervous system through a motor neuron, which is an efferent neuron, and that will go to an effector. And again, an effector could be a skeletal muscle or a gland or any number of things, but it allows us to actually respond to this stimulus. Before we look at a schematic of a reflex arc, let's discuss what these steps are step by step. So first off, we have 5 steps. So the very first thing is we have a stimulus. So this could be anything ranging from pain to heat to cold, pressure, vibration. Any of these things that our sensory neuron receptors are able to sense. So the stimulus activates that receptor and triggers it. So we have an action potential. And then when this happens, it's going to send that information on. So step 2 is with enough stimulation, that action potential is actually generated. So in step 1, we have a graded potential that occurs. In step 2, we've met threshold, so we have an action potential in that sensory neuron, and then that axon that enters the spinal cord is going to enter it through the posterior root. So remember, the posterior root brings in sensory information, the anterior sends out motor information. Step 3 is when that information has now arrived in the spinal cord, and it will arrive at one or maybe a couple more interneurons. And the interneurons are effectively like the brain of a reflex arc, if you want to think of it that way. They integrate the information coming from the sensory neurons and then coordinate what motor information needs to go out through the motor neurons to create some sort of response to the stimulus. So think of a reflex arc having the spinal cord and the interneuron specifically be the brain, because this information in the spinal reflex arc does not travel up any further to the central nervous system, to the brain. This information goes straight to the spinal cord and then right back out so we can respond quickly. Step 4 is when the interneurons actually stimulate the action potentials in the motor neurons and send that information out through the axon via the anterior route, which is an efferent pathway. And so now finally the last step is when the motor neuron stimulates the effector, which could be a muscle or a gland or anything that allows us to respond to get away from whatever it is that we need to get away from. Let's look at this next in a schematic. Figure 13-14 in your text shows you a schematic of what happens in a reflex arc. So let's start step number 1 and walk through this together. So step number 1 is when you have the arrival of a stimulus and activation of a receptor. So you can see the image of the hand there putting their hand down on a tack. So upon doing that, of course, it's going to hurt and startle you probably. So that stimulus activates the pain receptors or nociceptors in your hand, and that will activate a sensory neuron. So we're looking at step number 2 now, and you can see that the receptors are actually in the hand responding to the stimulus. So they send that information through that sensory neuron. As you can see, it's arriving at a ganglion, and then it goes through the posterior root and arrives at the spinal cord. So once it arrives at the spinal cord, it's going to be processed there because the spinal cord is part of our central nervous system. It's not just the brain, it is both the brain and the spinal cord. So it'll go from the spinal cord, and you can see that this interneuron in the spinal cord is going to allow a couple different things to happen. There's information that's actually going out relayed to the brain. You can see that going off towards the right as step number 3. So that allows you to think about it and be aware of what you're doing. But further, we have a response that happens right away, which is sending a motor signal to get our hand off of that tack. So that same information leaves through the anterior root. And when it goes out through the anterior root, it will activate a motor neuron to allow us to move. So finally, the 5th step is when we actually respond and the effector acts by lifting our hand up off of the tack. So by the way, keep in mind what's happening in the spinal cord here. You'll see that information coming in through the posterior root, and then that one neuron that's actually inside of the spinal cord, it's demonstrating divergence, right? Because what's happening here is information is going both out through the anterior root to the effector, and it's also going further up the central nervous system to the brain for additional information processing. So this is an example of divergence in that the information comes in from one point but goes out to 2 separate points. 4 of the ways that we classify reflexes are based off of the reflex's development. So for example, is it innate or acquired? The motor response, is that going to be a somatic reflex or a visceral reflex? Also, how complex is the neural circuit that's actually occurring, and where is the information processed? So we're going to discuss some different types of reflexes in the coming slides. So the first point of subdividing our reflexes and classifying them is to discuss how they're developed. And what this is referring to is, are these reflexes either innate or acquired? And innate reflexes are those that we are born with. So they are just totally genetically programmed. You can't really get rid of them at all. And so these basic neural reflex patterns are formed before we're even born. So some of these will include things like the withdrawal reflex, chewing, and visual tracking, which is, watching something as it moves, right? Our eyes actually follow automatically. The acquired reflexes are those that we learn over time, but they're still rapid and automatic responses. So after we do it repeatedly, it will enhance our ability to do this. So an example, of course, is braking a car in an emergency, right? If you see a pedestrian out in front of you or a deer very quickly, you're going to stomp on the brake before you've even really registered what's happened, because that's an acquired reflex. This is the same sort of thing that athletes practice over and over again. So a goalie playing hockey, for example, will know automatically how to move their hand to stop a puck that's coming at them. And of course, I have to give you this example because I'm from Canada and everybody I know plays hockey, but that's exactly what we're talking about. It's a reflex that's acquired because you have to learn to grab the puck rather than to try to get away from it. So goalies in soccer are the same, basically. Another way that we classify reflexes is based upon the motor response that is elicited by this reflex. So motor responses can be either somatic or visceral. And when we say somatic, we're meaning the musculoskeletal system. And when we say visceral, we basically mean almost any of our organs, because these are autonomic reflexes. So somatic reflexes, as you can imagine, since they allow us to move our skeletal muscle, are usually responses to something superficial, like something that our skin feels or our mucous membranes, for example, in our mouth. So some examples of these are things like the stretch or deep tendon reflexes, like the patellar and knee jerk, which we'll go into soon. And also there are some intermediate ones as well that are important in emergencies. So for example, if you slip or cut your finger, that you're going to respond very quickly to that as well. Now, visceral reflexes are those that include your stomach releasing certain hormones and chemicals after you've eaten a large meal, but there are reflexes that are triggered in response to some stimulus. They don't just happen independently. So smooth muscle can be involved in this. Cardiac muscle can respond to a variety of different stimuli as well, and of course our glands can too. Another way that we classify reflexes is based upon the complexity of the neural circuit. So when we discuss this, we're looking at whether a specific reflex is either a monosynaptic reflex, or alternatively, if it's more than one, it would be many, so a polysynaptic reflex. So a monosynaptic reflex just has a single synapse in between two different neurons, and this represents the simplest possible reflex because it's quick and there's not a lot of error that can get in the way with this, right? We have one sensory neuron directly synapsing onto another motor neuron. So we have an immediate sensation response very quickly. So it's a very fast response. Polysynaptic reflexes are just a little bit slower because we're going to have more synapses involved. So every time we have a synapse involved, remember we're triggering an action potential in the subsequent neuron. So these are going to have at least one interneuron in between the sensory neuron and the motor neuron, which is the most common type. There are also intersegmental reflex arcs, and these are where many spinal cord segments are going to interact, and that can produce a variable response. Lastly, when we discuss how reflexes are categorized, the last thing we'll look at is where is the information processed. So we have either spinal reflexes or cranial reflexes. So again, remember reflexes are going to be those that happen very quickly. The spinal reflexes are going to be the fastest because you have information that comes into the spinal cord and back out of it without having to go up to the brain. Cranial reflexes require processing in the brain. So if you feel something in your hand and the information has to go all the way up to your brain as opposed to just to your spinal cord, just the length alone can immediately give you an idea that of course this is going to take a little bit longer. Now let's look at monosynaptic and polysynaptic reflexes, section 13-7. One example of a monosynaptic reflex is the stretch reflex, which is best demonstrated by the patellar reflex, which you're probably already familiar with from going to the doctor's office as a child. So in a stretch reflex, what's happening is our skeletal muscle length is being regulated so it can either stretch or contract. And so this is a very quick reflex because it's taking advantage of large myelinated fibers, which are the fastest, as opposed to smaller myelinated fibers or unmyelinated fibers. Now keep in mind that monosynaptic reflexes have a single synapse. So what's happening here is a single sensory neuron is going to synapse on a single motor neuron, and that's it. So there's only two neurons involved in a monosynaptic reflex. So what's happening in the image on the right is you can see that the hammer is hitting the patellar tendon, which is going to pull the muscle, and so it stretches it out. So the stimulus is the muscle stretching. So when the receptor senses that distortion, it's going to send an action potential through the one single sensory neuron, and that information will travel towards the spinal cord. At the spinal cord, we have that one single synapse occur, and a second action potential occurs on the motor neuron. And that motor neuron is going to send that information down towards the effector, so that way the effector can affect the muscle and allow for contraction. So this is triggering a reflexive contraction, which will happen very, very quickly as opposed to just walking or running, which is something that you try to do consciously. This is something that will happen before you even think about it because this information gets processed by a direct response in your spinal cord and is not processed by the brain. Now let's take a look at the muscle spindle structure, because this is where we have all of the innervation that will allow for the muscle to move in something like the monosynaptic reflex that we just discussed. So muscle spindles are basically these sensory receptors that are involved in muscle that allow the muscle to respond to these different stimuli. So within these muscle spindles, we'll have both motor and sensory neurons. And we have two different terms here that we'll use, and that is intrafusal muscle fibers and extrafusal muscle fibers. So the intrafusal muscle fibers are the smaller ones, and they're specialized and they have the sensory neurons there. We also have extrafusal muscle fibers, and these are larger, and they're the ones that are actually responsible for controlling our resting muscle tone and muscular contraction. So when we start breaking down our sensory and motor neurons, the motor neurons here specifically in the muscle spindle have a different name. They're called gamma motor neurons. And then the axons of them are going to be called gamma efferents, right? Because they're receiving this information and creating movement. So this is the general overview of how the muscle spindle will be able to receive and both send information. So just to look at this just a little bit more closely, let's discuss how muscle spindle structure is affected in the reflex arc. So when we have the stimulus that occurs, whether that's stretching or whatever, the dendrites in those sensory neurons are going to be wrapped around the central region of the intrafusal fibers. Because remember, the intrafusal fibers are the small and specialized ones. So those dendrites are going to wrap around, and then this is where we'll have our action potential occur. So the sensory neuron is going to send via the axon that information up into the central nervous system via the posterior root at the spinal cord, right? Because remember, it comes in through the back door, out through the front door. So in through the posterior root comes the sensory information, and then that's going to synapse directly in the spinal cord onto a motor neuron. And remember, our motor neurons have a different name when we talk about this. Our motor neurons are gamma motor neurons. So via the gamma efferents, which is the axon, it's going to send the second action potential through down to the intrafusal fibers, which will respond to this motor neuron stimulus and allow the muscle to contract and return back to its normal resting length. Postural reflexes are a general broad category of a variety of different reflexes that include both monosynaptic and polysynaptic reflexes. And all they're doing is maintaining our posture, right? That we are able to keep upright and we don't just fall over into a blob all the time. So as you can imagine, in order to keep our body standing upright, a lot of different muscle groups need to be responding all at the same time. So our back, our abdominal muscles, we're just constantly making little tiny adjustments here and there that are postural reflexes. So these will maintain a firm muscle tone, because without a firm muscle tone, if our muscles all relaxed in our abdomen and back, again, we'd fall into a blob formation on the floor. So these are very sensitive receptors that allow little tiny fine-tuning adjustments to be made just repeatedly on a nonstop basis to allow us to stay upright. Now let's look at some more complicated reflexes. These are polysynaptic reflexes, which differ from the monosynaptic reflexes because we have more than one synapse. So because we have more than one synapse, it's possible for us to have those different neuronal pools activated that we looked at earlier. So we can have all sorts of different patterns of different reflex activity occurring. So polysynaptic reflexes, again, will have the sensory neuron, but will also have an inner neuron that will control different things, and that is the processing center to be able to send information to multiple muscle groups. So this can either produce either excitatory presynaptic potentials or inhibitory presynaptic potentials, and it can stimulate some muscles at the same time while inhibiting others. So polysynaptic reflexes are definitely more complicated. Some examples of these will include the tendon reflex, the withdrawal reflexes, and the cross-extensor reflex. You're going to be talking about all of this in your lab this week, and I think you're going to really enjoy practicing these. But let's talk about each of these next. The tendon reflex is basically our fail-safe against snapping our muscles by stretching too much and creating too much tension, which could tear or break tendons, right? So for the most part, when people tear or break a tendon doing something athletic, it's usually from some overexertion or a really big injury. It's not from something reflexive. But the tendon reflex is going to try to pull muscles back to prevent that sort of injury. The sensory receptors involved in the tendon reflex are the Golgi tendon organs. And these are stimulated whenever collagen fibers in the area are overstretched. So it'll stimulate inhibitory interneurons in the spinal cord, which will lead to more muscle tension, again, leading to more muscular inhibition. So again, this is just our fail-safe to prevent tearing or breaking of tendons. Another example of a polysynaptic reflex is the withdrawal reflex, which is just withdrawing from something that could be very injurious to us, such as pain or pressure. So this is demonstrated by the flexor reflex, which allows a muscle to flex to pull us away from something dangerous. So you can see the image on the right is the withdrawal reflex being demonstrated by somebody touching a hot pan on the stove without using an oven mitt. So when they feel that pain from that hot pan, the sensory receptors in the hand will send through the sensory receptors and through the sensory neuron up to the spinal cord a signal that will say, hey, this hurts, and then this gets processed at the spinal cord, and you can see that right at the spinal cord we have an interneuron, and that interneuron is again demonstrating divergence because we have information that is going to other parts of the spinal cord to allow for different types of movement. Also, it's going to send that same information to the central nervous system for processing consciously, so we recognize that something in fact hurt, so we're consciously aware of it. Another thing that's happening at the same time is that interneuron is going to be sending information to a motor neuron that can then exit and enter the extensor muscles. So those will be inhibited and the flexor muscles will be stimulated at the same time, so you can quickly drop the hot pan and not burn yourself. Reciprocal inhibition is interesting because it's required for flexor reflexes to work. So we can't just flex all the muscles because we have muscles that work in opposition to one another. So you have things that will flex while the opposite muscle relaxes and vice versa. So for the flexor reflex to work, we also have to have a stretch reflex relaxing the other muscles through reciprocal inhibition. So the interneurons in the spinal cord are responsible for that divergence of sending two different messages. So again, the interneurons are basically functioning as the brain of the spinal cord in a spinal reflex. So it can tell one message to the flexors and a different message to the extensors, so that overall you have one common response, which is to withdraw and let go from something hot or dangerous. Reflex arcs can also be ipsilateral or contralateral. Ipsilateral just meaning on the same side of the body, and contralateral, think contraband, on the opposite side of the body. So an ipsilateral reflex arc can apply to stretch, tendon, and withdrawal reflexes, and this makes sense, right? Because if your hand goes on something hot, let's say it's your right hand. If your right hand touches a hot pan, you're going to want to withdraw the right hand off of the pan because that's the one that's actually feeling the pain. The left hand would have absolutely no bearing on what's going on right now. So that would be an example of an ipsilateral reflex arc. Now, the cross-extensor reflexes are an example of a contralateral reflex arc because it's requiring a different side of your body to respond to this same stimulus. So as you can see in the image on the right, we have the cross-extensor reflex demonstrating that somebody with their right foot is stepping on a tack. So we have a couple things that need to happen. We need to, of course, lift that right foot up, right, to get it off of the tack, but we can't just lift our leg up and not adjust anything or we might fall over. So we have a second thing that has to happen, and that's that we have to shift our balance onto the left side of our body. So we have two different things that will be required. We'll need some muscles to be stimulated, some to be relaxed, and that will be on both sides, the right and the left. So what's happening here is the sensory neuron is sending the information up to the spinal cord for processing, where it meets the interneuron. And the interneuron is demonstrating divergence because it's sending information to a variety of places. So at the top of the image, it's showing that the interneuron is sending information to motor neurons in other areas of the spinal cord for further processing to be able to adjust other larger muscle groups. And then down at the bottom, what we see here at the anterior fissure on both the right and the left, on the anterior aspect, we have the motor neurons going out to extensors on the left, stimulating flexors. And on the right, you can see that we're having extensors that are stimulated, which will inhibit flexors. So we have both of these things happening at the same time, so our right leg can lift up off of the tack and our left leg can shift weight down. And this is maintained by a reverberating circuit. There are 5 general characteristics of polysynaptic reflexes, and the first is that it involves pools of interneurons. So those interneurons can cause either excitation or inhibition. Also, it's going to involve more than one spinal segment. And this is an important thing to recall because in a monosynaptic reflex, we have a single sensory neuron synapsing on a single motor neuron. So because of that, there's no way we can be going past the spinal cord into a different segment. We have to stay at that one individual segment. But in a polysynaptic reflex, that inner neuron can diverge and send information to a variety of different places, so it can involve more than one spinal segment, which can affect muscles in a variety of different areas. Also, another characteristic is that polysynaptic reflexes involve reciprocal inhibition. So what we're talking about here is that this is going to allow for the coordination of some muscles to contract and other muscles to relax. So in the flexor and cross extensor reflexes, you'll see that one muscle group might contract, but the same thing has to happen in reverse. The other muscles are going to have to relax in order to allow for the action to occur. Further, we have reverberating circuits here that are going to prolong this reflexive response beyond the time at which the stimulus ends. So, for example, that would mean that you would maintain your posture in the crossed extensor reflex. So that way you don't just hop onto your left foot after stepping on the nail with your right and then go right back to standing on the nail, because that would be ridiculous, right? So you're able to keep your right foot up off of the ground just for a second or two more. So that's the effect of the reverberating circuit. And then further, we may have several reflexes cooperating together in order to in order to coordinate a longer and more controlled response. All right, last, let's discuss section 13-8, which is brain facilitation and inhibition of reflexes. So far in this lecture, we've discussed how the spinal cord is going to basically be the main processing center for information that allows for reflexes to occur. But the brain actually has a role to play in some of these as well. But this is specifically applying to spinal reflexes that ascend to the brain. If they don't ascend to the brain, then there's not really a whole lot that the brain is doing with this. So if they ascend to the brain, then in that case, we'll have our automatic reflex behaviors also be processed simultaneously. So the brain can actually both amplify or tone down our responses. So that means it can facilitate or inhibit our spinal reflexes. So this applies to our voluntary movements, and it also applies to our reflex motor patterns. So spinal reflexes are going to have a very specific characteristic response, but the brain can modify that a little bit, so it's not just a really harsh response. So we're going to talk a little bit more about this coming up. The brain's role in regards to our spinal reflexes is really fascinating. So we have higher centers in our brain that can adjust how we respond to these reflexes by either stimulating or inhibiting the inner neurons in the brainstem or in the spinal cord. And so if it's excitatory, then we can chronically overstimulate these neurons, at which point the postsynaptic neurons will be in general facilitation. And facilitation is just going to be basically when we raise the depolarization basically to create a graded potential, so that way a subsequent action potential is much more easily generated. The exact opposite is true. Remember, for IPSPs, they will inhibit, right? So what they're doing is actually creating hyperpolarization, so it's even harder to bring that same neuron to an action potential. So over time, if we have chronically stimulated postsynaptic neurons, they will facilitate a spinal reflex, and that's called reinforcement, and so it will enhance the response of our spinal reflexes. But we can also have inhibition of the spinal reflexes, right? So for example, if somebody goes into the doctor's office and a little kid is in a bad mood and they don't want that patellar reflex to work, they may intentionally clench muscles to try to not kick their leg. So that is their higher center in their brain inhibiting the spinal reflex by stimulating inhibitory neurons and also creating IPSPs at the reflex motor neurons. So that suppresses the postsynaptic neurons, so that way it inhibits the reflex from actually occurring. Your textbook has a really neat example, by the way, about a Jendrassic maneuver, which will allow you to clasp your hands together if you're the student here, or the child in this example. So you hook your hands together, like interlocking them, and then we'll try to have the patient pull their hands apart, and at the same time the doctor will tap the knee, and that will confuse the brain from inhibiting the response down at your leg from keeping the foot from kicking. So if the student or patient is holding their hands together tightly, then that will allow them to actually kick quite hard and will bypass the inhibition response. The last two reflexes we're going to look at are the plantar reflex and the Babinski reflex. The plantar reflex is a normal expectation in adults, and if you take a sharp object, more or less, and poke it along the lateral plantar aspect of the foot and bring it forwards, the foot will reflexively curl forwards. Now, the Babinski reflex is the opposite of this, basically, where you have the same stick and you poke along the foot, and in a baby what will happen is the baby will flare their feet and their toes wide, and this is similar to the moral reflex in babies, which is part of their ability to try to be caught if they fall. So you can expect to see the Babinski reflex in infants, but if this happens in adults, this can be an indicator of central nervous system damage. Last two pop quiz questions. The cross-extensor reflex is A, monosynaptic and somatic, B, polysynaptic and somatic, C, monosynaptic and autonomic, or D, polysynaptic and autonomic. So first, let's look at whether it's autonomic or somatic. So we know that the autonomic nervous system regulates things like our gastrointestinal system's peristaltic waves, right? And the somatic system is more of our musculoskeletal system. So we know it has to be somatic. So we can rule out options C and D right away. So let's look at options A and B. One is monosynaptic, the other is polysynaptic. So how many synapses are occurring in the cross-extensor reflex? Well, we know the cross-extensor reflex is when you hop off of, say, your right foot that stepped on a tack, and you have to shift your weight over onto your left, onto the contralateral side. So because of this, right away we know it's a more complicated movement, but we also know that in a monosynaptic reflex, we have a single sensory neuron synapsing on a single motor neuron. And so that has to stay at the same level, right? So we know this can't be the case for something as complicated as this. So the answer is B, the polysynaptic and somatic option. Which of the following is an autonomic reflex? A, salivating, B, sweating, C, pupillary, D, A, B, and C are all autonomic, or E, neither A, B, nor C are autonomic. Okay, well that's tricky. So here, let's look at when we salivate. You could theoretically make yourself salivate if you thought long and hard enough about something tasty. But that said, you can't just will your salivary glands to secrete saliva, right? It happens as a result of you thinking about that food, but you can't just say, okay, salivary glands, let's go. So, okay, that's definitely autonomic. Sweating is the same way. You can definitely make it happen by exercising, but you can't, sitting still, just tell all your sweat glands to start perspiring. So that's definitely autonomic. And then the pupillary response too, yes, you can actually cognitively move your eyes around, but pupillary tracking and other responses are not something you can necessarily control. So the answer is D. A, B, and C are all autonomic. Earlier, when we were discussing neuronal pools and divergence, I got thinking about this poem, The Difference by Robert Frost, and I thought that some of you might really appreciate it. If you're not into poetry, you don't have to listen to this. Press stop and move it along, but if you are interested, I thought this might be something that you would really enjoy, because I think that some of you are really struggling right now trying to take care of your families and jobs and going to school, taking this difficult course online during a pandemic. So my heart is going out to you, and this poem just came to my mind because I thought you might relate to it. So here, I'm going to read it to you. The Difference. Two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both and be one traveler. Long I stood and looked down one as far as I could to where it bent in the undergrowth. Then took the other as just as fair, and having perhaps the better claim, because it was grassy and wanted wear, though as for that the passing there had worn them really about the same. And both that morning equally lay in leaves no step had trodden black. Oh, I kept the first for another day. Yet knowing how way leads on to way, I doubted if I should ever come back. I shall be telling this with a sigh, somewhere ages and ages hence. Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by. And that has made all of the difference. I think that you guys are choosing the road less traveled by. You are doing it. You are going to school during a difficult time, taking a difficult course, and I'm just so proud of you. So I hope you enjoyed the poem, and study hard, guys. You're doing great, and I am always here to Zoom anytime.